Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of RE011, where I take old stories that I've done and update them to new standards. Now, this story is something special. Everybody keeps asking me what my favorite story is, and I say, I can't remember. I can't remember the title. It was one of the first ones. This is it. This is the story. So, I hope you watch this story to death, and then just watch it again and again and again, so that this story can get the most views on the channel, so that I can never forget what the story is called ever again. So, let's get on to the story. What makes humans special? Click here to find out. My personal favorite, written by RegalLegalEagle. When I look back on the fateful day, I always find it funny how quickly my entire mood changed the moment I stepped into that room. When our expedition fleet found nothing short of an armada waiting for us in what we assumed was just another empty, uncharted system, I thought I was in some sort of nightmare. As we tried to communicate, the bridge was incredibly tense, and the only thing keeping me together was knowing that I had to reassure the other captains that everything would be fine. All sorts of things rushed through my head. Were they hostile? Would they destroy us? Would we be subject to horrible experiments? I wasn't a particularly optimistic person. When we finally established some shaky translations, we discovered that they weren't simply going to blow us away, which was nice. But we did learn that they were from some sort of massive empire, which set me on a new set of worried thoughts. Was this the start of some grand war? The Second Interstellar War had just finished, and the thought of taking Xenos in open conflict for the first time did not seem promising. Then they said they wanted to talk to the human in charge. Well, since that was me, I told them that I'd be arriving in an unarmed shuttle shortly. While the shuttle didn't have any weapons on it per se, I did have the armory load all the explosives we had into it and give me a remote detonator just in case. Flying the ship over to that armada, I was struck by just how uniform everything was. Compared to the ever-changing fleets that I was used to, it looked like every ship they had was built and designed for a specific purpose. It was rather awe-inspiring to think that some Xenos who had been hiding from us all this time had perfected their ideal ship designs and hadn't had to retrofit the ship in their lifetime. Looking back on our small fleet, I couldn't see two designs that matched. Technically, the Stingray and Rover had started life the same design, but over the war, the Stingray had been turned into a comm hub and had all sorts of obviously bolted-on dishes and antennae all over the place. It looked more like a pufferfish than a Stingray. The Rover, on the other hand, had been set up as a courier vessel. So some of the old parts had been stripped away so that they could make it sleeker and add bigger engines. How barbaric we must have seemed to them, I thought. The hangar on the capital ship was much the same. I saw rows and rows of pristine, identical craft. Everything was clean, uniform, well-designed. If it came to a war, we'd be crushed, I figured. The soldiers that escorted me were the only aspects that weren't uniform. They had 3 or 4 different species in clean-looking armor suits. It was hard to keep decent pace, since they all had different legs and moved at various speeds. But their armor and weapons looked far less improvised than the Marines back on my ship. But then, I entered the boardroom at the center of the ship to meet the various dignitaries waiting for me, and all my worries changed. I wasn't a xenobiologist or psychologist or the like, but you don't get as far as I did without learning how to read people. Even Xenos I'd never seen before. They were nervous. I held back a laugh and wondered instead why this massive armada would be nervous about a lone human from a small expedition fleet. They asked me to sit down behind a desk before the panel of dignitaries, and my first thought was presenting my thesis back in college before being pressed into naval service during the First Interstellar War. They took their time setting up a translation device for me, seeming to want to study me for a bit as I waited. I just smiled back at them, filled with confidence which clearly unsettled them further. Finally, the device was set and the conversation began. They introduced themselves and explained to me a little about the Confederation. They were democratic, which was good. They didn't seek out war, which was good. But they were very nervous about our young species. At first I figured they just meant that as in we were the most recent to make it to this level of technology. I asked them why they were so nervous, and they got quiet. Then came the big question that I hadn't expected. How have you developed your technology so quickly? Are you being guided by another spacefaring species? I laughed at first, thinking that it was an absurd question, but then stopped when I realized it was serious. I was confused and, of course, explained that this was our first contact with another intelligent life form, let alone a whole gathering of them. They looked a little more nervous then. Are you driven by war? I explained to them that we weren't, and they said, then how have you developed your technology so quickly? The last time we sent a probe to your world, you had just developed the technology to sail across your largest ocean. From what we can tell, you hadn't fully mastered gunpowder yet. This fleet was assembled to approach your home at what should have been the early years of your industrial age to help guide you, only to find out that you've spread not just to your local system, but in a range of 100 light years. How is that possible? I laughed again for a moment because it seemed absurd again to me. They were likely talking about the 16 or 1700s, and they figured 500 or 600 years later, we would have just reached the industrial age. I told them that we'd gone from the first powered flight to landing on the moon in roughly 66 years, and they gasped. They said that it was impossible. How could we have developed so fast? I thought it over for a moment. I wasn't a philosopher by trade, even though I'd gone to school for it all those years ago. It was the sort of thing I hadn't bothered to ponder in quite some time. I sat there quietly as they watched me and thought it over. I was tempted to say that war drove our ability to learn and develop quickly, but that just didn't sit right with me. There were plenty of periods in our history that weren't overly violent, and yet still we developed. And just as they seemed ready to demand an answer, I remembered a rather simple conversation I had with a fellow captain. He had commented on how his children got upset if they went more than a week without a vid from him, despite the fact that when we were young, it took months to get vids back from the forward fleets. They took everything for granted. So, I finally spoke. I'm sure this wasn't how many politicians or academics would have wanted me to phrase it, but my time with the Navy had made me blunt. We get bored quickly. Not only that, but the speed with which we turn the amazing into the mundane is staggering. They were obviously confused. We did go from our first basic airplanes to landing on the moon in about 66 years. But 30 years after that, people were already starting to find going to space rather boring. People wondered why we spend so much money on it. It took another 40 years after that to focus on it once more. In that time, we developed communication technologies at a staggering rate. We connected our world in a way that had never been done before. But almost before we were finished, people were trying to create something else. I laughed for a moment as I thought it over. We could fly across the globe in hours, but most people complained that the planes were cramped and the food was bad. We would create our first wireless networks that could stream the full collection of human knowledge to the phones, and people complained about the speeds and reliability, even though they wasted all their data on frivolous things. Once we established our first colonies on the moon and then Mars, taxpayers began to complain about how much it cost, and tourists again complained about how long it took to get there, or how zero-G made them sick. The more I thought it over, the more it made me laugh, as I had to explain to this panel of Xenos that boredom spurred our advances. Our species is made of consumers. You can take any amazing, incredible discovery that took a team of engineers a lifetime to create and find a person bored with it in a very short time. It took adventurous souls to start the first colonies off our homeworld, but it took normal, bored citizens to truly make those colonies work. When someone was willing to move to Mars or Saturn because they could get a 10% raise, that's when we knew we needed to keep going. The first test pilot that jumped into another star was a hero to us for all of a few years. Then we wanted to know why everyone couldn't jump to another star. I shrugged. Our wars are only because we're bored. As soon as survival on the first colonies around the other stars became easy, they got bored. With bored colonists comes rebellion. The second war we just finished, well, everything was quiet and peaceful until the first colonies became the first core planets and travel between our furthest colonies became steady. When I first jumped to another star system, I was thrilled and excited. But I looked around the bridge of the ship and noticed that everyone else was bored. Just another routine jump to an uncharted system for the sake of testing out our equipment. This was the furthest humanity had ever gone. But the first thing the captain said was simply, "Feck, that star's right. Someone hit the shades and plot us a course back." No one thought anything about it. I laughed once more and smiled back in memory. Going into the jump here, my crew was bored and I was thinking about what to have for dinner. I'm now light years further out than we've ever been and something like 90 light years away from the first jump I took. I had to field complaints from some of our crew that we've run out of fruit juice sooner than expected. Not that our ships are slapped together and we have to continuously fix them. Not that in case something catastrophic happens, we're too far from help to be saved. Not that they miss their families. Fruit juice. I was quiet for a moment as I thought back to see if I had missed anything, and then threw up my arms. How could I forget? In a month or so, I'm going to be a grandmother. My eldest is having his first child. Do you think he'd be worried if I was sent off on an expedition to chart the unknown? No, he just wanted to make sure that I'd be able to send a few vids of advice in handling a newborn, and at the least, I'd be back for the child's first birthday next year. He also complained how expensive gene therapy was. Gene therapy, which wasn't possible when I was a kid, and was brand new when I was his age. We get bored, we complain, someone makes money making something new. That's about all there is to it. They were quiet. They turned off the device and spoke amongst themselves for a while, as I just chuckled, thinking about how I described our entire species. Finally, they turned my device back on and asked us if we could teach them how to be bored. I smiled and said that we could try, but we might get bored of it before long. That's how our first contact worked. I never did tell them about the explosives on the shuttle. I became a media sensation for a little while. Then, the next news cycle, everyone was going crazy about the Xeno fashion sense. They made me ambassador, which worked all right. They still ask me to give workshops on boredom. I find it hilarious they now have advanced degrees on making things mundane to try and hold their slim edge over us in technology. But it's not going to work. No one is better than humans at being bored. Taken from an interview with ex-ambassador and retired Admiral Tina Perry. Similar topics include the virtue of laziness, making boredom work for you, a beginner's guide, how to make a fortune teaching Xenos about mundane in 6 easy steps, hot clicks, 10 things you don't know about jump travel, wardrobe malfunction or publicity stunt, what would you know about the recent presidential debate? Are there actually hot Xeno singles in your area? What dating sites don't want you to know? End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps, Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Light Jock, Dragzoon WRE, and Lord Azrakal. Thank you very much.